One of the big things for me was to say, when we kick off a project, when we want to actually do something differently, is we need to understand, we need to be able to track both technology aspects of it, but also the business benefits, the metrics we care about. How is this going to move the needle?
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOn community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company, helping companies fix vulnerabilities in their open source components and containers without slowing down development. To learn more, visit snyk.io. SNYK.io. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. On today's episode, Guy Podjarny, president and founder of Snyk, is joined by James Turnbull. James is an engineering leader, author, and open source developer, and is currently the VP of Engineering at Timber, working on the open source observability platform Vector. He was formerly the CTO in resident at Microsoft, CTO and founder of Empathico, and CTO at Kickstarter. He has held leadership roles at Docker, Venmo, and Puppet, and was the chair of O'Reilly's Velocity Conference.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning back into The Secure Developer. Today, we're going to have a DevOps-flavored episode here. I'm really happy to have with us James Turnbull, who is a VP Engineering at Timber, and also kind of a long-time DevOps thought leader. Has been the chair of Velocity, has sort of been very much a core part of the DevOps journey, making him especially qualified to discuss a little bit about how it's similar or different to the DevSecOps journey. So James, thanks for coming on to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So James, before we dig into the topic of substance, tell us a little bit about what is it that you do and maybe your journey and how we touch security.
Sure. I lead engineering product teams. At the moment, I'm working on a product called Vector, which is an open source observability tool. I've been an engineer for about 25 years, or no, I think it's too many years to start citing that. And I started my career off largely in sort of enterprise banking finance as a security engineer and a security architect for a few years in a retail bank. I built perimeter systems and ATM networks and stuff like that. In the last 10 years or so, I've largely worked in high growth startups. I was an early employee at Puppet, configuration management tool. I was an early employee at Docker, obviously do containerization. And I was the CTO at Kickstarter, and have sort of done similar sorts of roles over the last few years. As you said, I was the chair of the Velocity Conference for a couple of years, and also I write technology books. I've written 11 books about engineering and infrastructure.
11 books is impressive. I have a few under my belt, but 11 books is definitely a notable number there.
No kids, I think, is probably an advantage.
Makes for some free time. So I'm curious a little bit. Quite a few guests that came onto the show have gotten into security from maybe the operations, and you've actually were in security, but then you moved outwards. Do you remember that transition, that sort of decision point of whether you want to leave security and go to a role that doesn't have security in the title?
Yeah, I was managing a CERT team, a computer emergency response team at a retail bank, and one of the things I've been thinking about the last 3 or 4 years before that was sort of large-scale infrastructure management. One of the very frustrating things about being a security person in a large organization is you don't control the infrastructure. You are largely dependent on infrastructure teams to provide you with information about vulnerabilities, about the state of the infrastructure, and you're largely reliant on them to do remediation for you. And they would obviously come to me and say, we don't have any tools that allow us to mass maintain, mass patch all of these systems. We don't use large-scale package management. We don't have any configuration management tools. So I sort of started looking in that area, and about the same time I found Puppet, started working the open source Puppet tool. And when they raised some money, I thought I can see the viability of this tool. I work in the environments where this is a desperate need. And so I came on board at Puppet to try and bring some of that experience. And I think I was probably our first pre-sales person, as well as being head of community and professional services and a bunch of other things along the way. So try to inject that flavor of like, this is what a large enterprise, this is their experience, this is the empathy I have for their problems. I think the very first customer I was involved in New York Stock Exchange. It was customers of that sort of flavor where my experience resonated.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. And it's interesting around this taking ownership, basically, or being frustrated about not being able to control and address those issues. And you very much scratched your own itch with the move to the solution itself. And in the world of Puppet. So that's pretty good. It's actually interesting that, Puppet, I think recently, maybe in the last couple of years, have actually launched a remediation focused solution that indeed focuses, it sounds maybe like on the same problem space that you've just been describing as a nice.
Yeah. They've had a couple of stabs at it. Carl, who was a product manager there for a while, originally built a sort of patch management, vulnerability management system like 2012 or 2013, but it proved to be a non-trivial problem to solve. But yes, it's definitely one of those areas where we have a lot of information about vulnerabilities. We have a lot more ability to interrogate hosts and work out what's wrong. We still have the challenge of how do you remediate those in a safe and reliable way? How do you ensure that there's no downtime? And so I think those problems are the ones that Puppet is trying to work out. How do we solve? How do we take these feeds of data and turn them into actions or execution that organizations can undertake?
Yeah, very much. I mean, there's also been some surrounding changes, right, with the adoption of Kubernetes, and as you pointed out, the ability to interrogate environments and ask for more information. So let's indeed maybe go down this path of the DevOps analogy and maybe a reverse path of your journey, and talk a little bit about the analogies, in the DevOps journey and in these changes of tools, and where is it that we can learn from them in security versus where do they differ and should be done differently? And I thought maybe a helpful model for us to try and follow here is this people, process, technology type trial. So let's start from that first one there, people. Maybe I'll start by having you describe, because people have different definitions of the people aspect of DevOps. When you think about the people changes required to do DevOps successfully, how do you answer that?
So, I think the people aspect of DevOps is probably the most important aspect of it. My best interactions or my best sort of successes in building things or working on things or operating things was because I had good relationships with the folks all part of the process, whether they be software engineers, DBAs, or security people, or audit risk people. It's a relationship-driven process. So to me, the DevOps thing is really about building a bridge between folks who previously perhaps didn't have a conversation. And there wasn't necessarily any antagonism there. It was literally like, I do a job, I build an artifact, I give that artifact to some other people. Those other people do something with it, and sometimes they come and tell me that it's broken. Obviously, there's a little bit of friction in there with regards to like the ops side of things, get other people that live with the outage and so forth. But it's really about like, okay, the ops people have a set of expectations and constraints, and they have some needs. If they had a conversation with the people building the thing in the first place at first principles, would some of that process be smoother? Would the friction be reduced? Would the potential for outages be reduced? So to me, that having a conversation, having a good relationship, understanding everybody's needs is sort of the key to that sort of DevOps thing. And obviously, there's lots of tools and various bits and pieces in that automate a number of those processes and sort of reduce the human effort requirement, but it all stems from having that conversation in the first place.
Yeah, very much relate to this, but I guess maybe let me ask you from a security change perspective. So now when you think, okay, we want to do DevSecOps, and I'm using this buzzword fairly loosely over here, it's just a simple way of saying embed security into the DevOps existence, if you will, or processes. Do you see it the same? Do you also think really the most important piece is the people piece?
I think so. I think there's a couple of levels of this. When I started out in security, there was a generation or even a couple of generations before me who saw their role as saying no to things. Like they were really saw themselves as guardians of the business and the enterprise. The easiest way to safeguard those organizations was to say, no, we shouldn't do this. I probably belong to the next generation that came along, and I left security about the same time as this was becoming more sort of status quo. But a bunch of people who really said that, no, our job is not to say no. Our job is to say, present the risk, present options about how you might mediate the risk in some way, with a view to like allowing the business to do what it needs to do to make money in fast and efficient and safest way possible. It's their risk appetite and not our risk appetite. And our job is to explain to them the decisions they're making and what the impact is, but it's really their ownership. They own the business risk in a way that we don't. And I feel like this is this resonates really strongly with me in the sort of DevOps sort of world. Is ultimately the outcome is you want to move fast and ship things, right? You want to be able to take the time from code, not earning any money on a developer's desktop, to code running in production and making your business money. And one of the sort of caveats in there, one of the things in there is you want to do that in a secure way as well as an efficient sort of way. So security becomes another stakeholder in that DevOps lifecycle. And their job is really to say, okay, we have policy or we have process or we have information we need from you that bubbles up and allows us to do our jobs. Like if we give you that information up front before you build the things or before you deploy them, then hopefully that reduces the friction or reduces the last minute conversations you get in a lot of projects where the security team rocks up and says, look, we just looked at your encryption and it doesn't meet our standards. You can't deploy this, right? That's not a conversation you want to have 20 minutes before you're pushing the button to go live with PR ready and the business going, what the insert swear word here is going on. We have customers waiting. So to me, that there's a very strong overlap between the sort of needs there.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. I think people is at the end of the day what needs to change, and I guess removing friction, use that word, right? Removing friction between the different groups. I'm trying to say today, when you think about DevOps, I think there's already an acknowledgement that a high performing organization or DevOps organization that does DevOps well, performs better from a business perspective, right? There's all these studies that demonstrate how that is happening, but it's also, I think it's internalized in the day-to-day and the community narrative. People understand that, there's pride in being, a good SRE or a good DevOps practice. And even businesses, I think, increasingly understand that being great at that implies being better at business, being more competitive. But it's a bit hindsight. This is already like celebrating the success. I'm sure there's a lot of challenges still in DevOps adoptions as well. But if you harken back a little bit to the beginning, what are some tips and tricks or some, not just tricks, but core practices that helped break that mold, that helped the ops department stop becoming the department of no and not giving you a server and just caring about mitigating change to mitigate the risk of the system going down. Security is oftentimes received in the same way. Are there some learnings about how we manage to turn the tide in the ops space that we can apply to security?
I think so. A big thing for a lot of ops people and for a lot of developers too is their experience of what the business actually does, what the customer's experience was secondhand or removed. In the case of software engineers, it was probably mediated by program managers and business analysts. And they often never spoke to someone who actually dealt with customers. And ops people, it was even further removed. Maybe there was support people between them. But if they were sort of getting third-hand things from software engineers, or getting them from business analysts, or getting them from product owners, there's a fair way down the chain there. One of the big things for me was to say, when we kick off a project, when we want to actually do something differently, is we need to understand, we need to be able to track both the sort of technology aspects of it, but also the business benefits, the metrics we care about. How is this going to move the needle? If I'm the CFO and I walk in the door and say, you want to spend $1 million on this security remediation project, what do I get from that? Like, how do I measure the success? And I think a big thing is helping people understand, like, this has a tangible impact, like in reducing latency or helping us ship faster, has a tangible impact on customer satisfaction, on retention, on reducing churn, on conversion, all those sorts of things. And when you start to see your actions tied to an actual business outcome, you feel more stronger, you feel more empathy for the folks that are actually on the front line and talking to the customers. And you get the resulting sort of adjacent benefit of being able to articulate your needs in terms of budget or people in a way that the business understands. Like, they're not interested in widgets. You tell a CFO, like, we're going to upgrade from widget 2.0 to 2.3 and it's going to cost $1 million. And the CFO goes, I don't care. What does that mean? You say to them, actually, we're going to upgrade this part of our infrastructure. And as a result, we think we're going to be able to ship 20% faster, or we're going to reduce the downtime we have on Saturdays from an hour to 15 minutes. Like, that's a tangible business impact that the CFO can walk away and go, okay, that's a worthwhile investment. And I think that benefit is sometimes understated in their sort of first principles.
Yeah, I love that approach because it's indeed very applicable to security. If you just ask the business question and make sure that there's an understanding there, arguably, oftentimes the business question is even easier for security than ops in many occasions. Still digging a little bit into a specific item there, which was reducing the risk of downtime. Again, there's pretty elaborate practices right now around measuring, and I think I'm slipping a little bit into process here. But again, in DevOps, there are some practices today that measure error budgets and maybe quantify it. But I think a thing that is still reasonably art is saying, okay, if I make this change, I will reduce the risk of an outage by a certain amount. When you think today to the world, and you clearly live in observability and those kind of worlds that really try to help improve resilience and uptime, what are your sort of favorite means of mapping a change or an effort to an anticipated outcome of whether it will actually reduce the risk of an outage? And I guess I'm thinking clearly about how does that map to mapping into security.
I think this is an unsolved problem. I think you have, SLOs and budgets and mean time to recovery. It's sort of like if you improve the resilience of something and therefore uptime adds a 9 to the 9.9 or whatever, to some extent, it's hard to draw a line between the thing we did and that sort of resilience outcome. I think error budgets and SLOs are probably a better way to think about things than MTTR and uptime, just because distributed systems mean that I don't know that there's any such thing as monoliths lend themselves better to that MTR sort of uptime view, but distributed systems is more a budget of like, we can cope with 0.001% of 5xx HTTP errors or something like that. So yeah, I don't think this is an easy problem to solve. And the same thing has existed in the security world for a long time. Like, how do you measure security? I think David Linus, who was one of the COSAC organizers, once described it as securitons. Like, if I spend $1 million, do I get more securitons? And what securitons per million is the correct measurement for an enterprise to be secure? We have a ways to go before we can sort of translate it into risk terms that a business understands. Yeah, at this stage of the game, my thought is collect all of the data you can, measure the behavior, measure the state of things, and then work out when you pull a lever, what metrics change. And for a lot of folks, they are already reverse engineering their monitoring system or their observability system on top of their application, because previously they may have only managed disk memory or CPU and uptime or something like that, rather than sort of application throughput or performance. That sort of SRE view of like the application's health being the key to observability is a much more recent phenomena. So yeah, I don't think I have a good answer, sadly. There needs to be some sort of middleware in there between the sort of concept of risk, which is obviously security people and audit people, and risk analysts have a pretty clear idea of what that looks like, and they have frameworks and tools, and our view of sort of infrastructure and applications.
Yeah, I think, first of all, you saw right through my question that I was really asking, how do you measure security? I was just trying to get at it from the DevOps side, and I'm always in search for that holy grail of how do you measure that. And it's indeed, though, but I think as you described, I agree. I think it's one of the key differences, though, between the change in ops and the change in security, because security doesn't have as good a feedback loop as ops. Yeah. We're fortunate enough for systems to go down more often. And so we have a certain ability to know whether our decisions were right or not, as compared to breaches, which I guess we're also, again, fortunate enough that there aren't enough of those, or at least enough of those that we know of, to serve as the same type of feedback cycle. So it's just harder to know if you're doing something right or wrong. However, what you mentioned about SLOs being maybe potentially SLOs and error budgets being maybe a better measure for the world of microservices, where systems are not holistically up or down, rather have different pieces, that actually aligns with what is probably the most prevalent answer I get when I try to snip around this area, which is people look for efficacy of a security control, or not so much efficacy of it, but rather how well applied is it? Is it in place? Is it surveying X amount of the activity, X percent of the activity that is going through it? And so if your security controls are applied properly, you basically now assume, there's a certain leap of faith here, or trust in your team's analysis, that your security risk is mitigated accordingly, which I guess is not that dissimilar to choosing your service level indicators and service level objective, and then just sort of seeing how close you get to it.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a difference between the sort of the unknown unknowns that sort of exist in the infrastructure world. I think there are probably a smaller number of those. I think it's easier to reason about infrastructure, and I'm probably going to get a bunch of infrastructure people to tell me I'm a horrible person for saying this, but I think it is easier to reason about infrastructure failure modes than it is to reason about security failure modes. I guess someone like John Allsport would probably argue that the human aspect of it is the uncertainty element in reasoning about sort of infrastructure applications. In the security world, the fact that you have the human element of someone not understanding their security education, or being catfished or being spearfished or something like that, combined with the fact you also have malicious actors of a variety ranging from script kiddies to nation states, means that there's a lot of unknown unknowns in the security world that make it harder to reason about the state of security than it does to reason about the state of infrastructure. I haven't thought too far down that path, but it feels like that resonates with me based on living in both those worlds.
Yeah, and I like the unknown unknowns, or the kind of the degrees of freedom almost element to it, which is you have the human element, but you also have the adversary, which doesn't exist in operations. People are not well, I guess if they are intentionally trying to take you down, it becomes a security problem at that point.
Yes, there's an overlap there, obviously. The Venn diagram is there, but definitely in terms of like information disclosure, and there are a different category of adversary in the security world.
So maybe, we've already kind of slipped a little bit into process, I guess, if you think about metrics as more a measure of process and how do you measure success. But when you think about DevOps processes, there's definitely a lot of practices that have evolved. And maybe the right question to ask here is which of these practices that evolved in DevOps should basically now be applied to security as well? I think the process area, the overlap maybe sits a little bit more between DevOps and SecOps than necessarily taking this back into the development process. Maybe I'll throw a few processes at you, and I'm probably going to slip into technology because I'm bad at these delineations. But when you think about these processes, let's maybe talk through when should they be the same for DevOps and when should they be separate. And the first one that comes to my mind is incident response. So incident response at the moment separates, I think, in many cases. Is that right? Is that wrong? How do you think about those two merging or not?
Certainly when I was in the last bank I worked in, the security incident process was separate from the ops incident process. I think that technology is now so commingled that having two separate incident processes or having no bridge between the two processes or no easy transition is probably the wrong mode of operation. I think almost any remediation action that a security person is going to take is almost certainly going to have an infrastructure impact or require infrastructure engagement. So if those people are not an integral part of your incident process, and a lot of people treat them as like a service provider, it's like our telco and our ops team and maybe our application development team. And it's sort of like they're not a subordinate sort of thing here, that they're a partner in bubbling up the information you need, in ensuring that the decisions you make from a security perspective don't have an adverse infrastructure perspective, that changes you make to remediate a security incident also won't have some sort of adverse infrastructure impact. So I think that the parties need to be at least a lot closer together. And to some extent, I feel like having a dual or parallel incident process is probably going to create friction in that sort of collaboration community kind of way. Obviously, not everybody is going to need to be there for every call, but I can't think of tremendously many security incidents that don't have some sort of infrastructure overlap. Somebody has used a vulnerability to compromise a thing and we have a breach, distributed denial of service. Like all of those things require people to be pulling the levers and turning the knobs in the infrastructure world as well as the security world. I think that they will ultimately have to merge together. And by extension, I suppose, SOCs and NOCs, are they two different things? Are they the one thing?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. I relate to your flow. And in fact, I think in some conversations I've had here, people talked about using PagerDuty, for instance, for security incident response. I believe that's what we use at Snyk. We actually use the same tooling to trigger that alert. Probably a little bit different when you're trying to ascertain if it is indeed a breach or not. I think it might touch, I intentionally maybe brought up one that sits in not just in the twilight zone between security and operations, but also sits between product security and enterprise security.
Yep.
Because, when an employee potentially leaked information, that might also trigger a leak to the SOC. So it's interesting to see whether, like a few others, the product security incident response maybe aligns more, as you point out, with the remediation aspect of it, which is more infrastructure oriented or sort of more DevOps aligned, while the enterprise security parts might find themselves veering further apart and having the SOC serve mostly that purpose versus the product security incident.
And I guess there's some overlap there with, like, for example, what we described in banking as sort of global security, or which was probably described as physical security in a lot of places, with an entirely separate organization with its own incident response. And they would often engage us because information disclosures were often the results of physical security breaches. But yeah, there's definitely some more things intertwined there that perhaps not so much in the infrastructure world.
Yeah. So I guess you've opened this a little bit with the SOC and the NOC, but you're also building an observability tool. So maybe use that a little bit in this sort of potentially process, potentially technology section here to talk about security observability. Do you see people using, whether it's your own solution or other observability tools, for security monitoring as well to identify something that is a suspected security issue?
Yeah, we do. Certainly in the case of Vector, two of our largest users are both security companies. This is something that's always actually slightly frustrated me about the sort of security DevOps, DevSecOps sort of thing, is that if you look at the signal that security teams collect using tools or processes, and you look at the signal that infrastructure and teams collect and application development teams instrument their applications to emit, the Venn diagram there's a big overlap there, right? perhaps you're looking at a slightly different facet of that information, but it's essentially the same information you're looking at. The state of the asset in some way. Maybe a security person cares about patch level and an ops person cares about HTTP code metric or something like that. But you're mostly looking at the same assets and collecting information on them. It seems to me that there's definitely an opportunity here for people to say, how about we have one tool, collect all of this information, and we route the right information to the right people with the right decoration attached to it, the right enrichment, and we then stop us having to have 5 security agents installed on a host, as well as the infrastructure team's APM agent and their logging agent. And I've literally walked into customers where they have 2 Splunk agents running on the same box, right? One for the security team and one for the application team. And I've certainly seen environments where a fraud team is getting feeds from security as well as infrastructure, who are running entirely separate and parallel event pipelines to provide this one team with 2 facets of the same information about the same assets. And just like, how much money would we save if we just built one pipeline that happened to be a bit more sophisticated or a bit more flavorful than 2, both in terms of CapEx and OpEx? So this is one of the aspects where I think that security can learn a lot from the sort of, I think it's an underlying DevOps desire to monitor everything or observe everything or track everything. Security can greatly benefit from that.
Yeah, and I love the Splunk analogy because my perception is that Splunk and Sumo Logic, when they started, they were perceived primarily as an ops tool. It was really log aggregation or aggregate the data. It was about monitoring. And today, I believe, I haven't sort of tracked them, but I think they are primarily security tools. They are primarily SIMs. Definitely Splunk, I think a lot of their revenue comes from the SIM space. If I'm not mistaken, they're the leading SIM vendor, which is interesting. Like, it's sort of not discussed often enough. To an extent, it's a bit of a success story in terms of ops to sec. Maybe it doesn't involve quite the DevOps, but
yeah, I mean, that's definitely the Splunk journey, was that originally ops tool. And I think they struggled to get traction for a number of reasons. I think mostly because there wasn't a huge level of maturity in the operations world about what logs are useful for. Like, more often than not, they were post-incident sort of analysis tools. If you're getting a log entry that tells you something's wrong, you're probably a step behind the problem anyway. Whereas security people are looking at trends and they're looking at patterns and they're looking, and same with fraud detection people, they're like, someone's used this ATM at 4:00 in the morning 3 times in a row, and they've used this. There's a pattern you're identifying of like a bad actor doing something or an anomaly of some kind in the information, where the thought about the use of the data was more mature. And so, yeah, them sliding into that niche was obviously very successful for them. And now I see them actually coming out of that niche. And you can see the same thing happen with folks like Datadog and stuff like that, who've just introduced a logging tool of their own. They're like, okay, logs are actually of value to us from an infrastructure point of view now that we're more mature about thinking about it. We are looking for anomalies in the same way that security people are, but we're looking for performance anomalies, or we're looking for outage anomalies, or some abnormal behavior that is causing us a problem with a latency or with a job of some kind or something like that.
I really like that. First of all, you're right that at the end of the day, today, ops and security are both looking for deviations from the norm. Might just be looking something different, but being able to define, and maybe this is with the advent of machine learning and the ability to define norm in more concrete terms than ever. That's nice. But I also like how, in your sentence, you basically described how we had a scenario where, to an extent, security was ahead, and a practice went from security into the world of ops, where maybe it was previously adopted there, where clearly, I think most of our conversations goes the other way around. Most of the conversation talks about how security should adopt practices where maybe the ops or the DevOps world has gone ahead, but I think both are very relevant.
I think anomaly detection certainly is security is significantly more advanced in the use of anomaly detection. And all of the early examples of folks who are building anomaly detection tools on top of infrastructure, like to identify like patterns of that, they were all basically lifting papers from security people. I'd be like, I saw that at RSA, and now I can see someone actually using that algorithm to try and like work out whether they can use it to pump all that metric data through it and work out whether they can detect some. And obviously it's not a perfect one for one, and many of those things were failures because they weren't looking for precisely the right thing. But the fact that they took from that well was pretty telling to me.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a little bit personally, my personal journey kind of had both of those iterations happen. So I went from the world of application security, where, built a DAST tool and a SAST tool, and then left security, and my thought was, hey, in security, we have this deep application analysis that we know how to do. Where else would that be useful? And I found myself in performance, building front-end optimization tools that says, well, you can use that intelligence to make applications faster. And then in that world of performance, got into DevOps. That's when DevOps was growing and the practices. And hey, there's a different way to engage development, which we always wanted to do. There's a different path. And then Snyk really came out of that. So saying, okay, let's apply the DevOps way of implementing security. And that worked out very well. So I guess that didn't occur to me until now, but it's that journey was in my own personal journey as well.
I must ask Steve Sowders one of these days. Obviously, he's one of the sort of leading exponents of apps, front-end application performance, and basically about collecting data and metrics and measuring things. And obviously doing a bunch of that thinking at the same time as Google as sort of the SRE folks came around. I've never asked him, but I presume there must have been some cross-pollination there. And certainly, given Google's caring about the sort of the front-end customer experience to some extent, or largely because of ads rather than anything else. But I wonder if there was some sort of cross-pollination that happened there. I think it'll be an interesting thread to pull on at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even at the core of the Velocity conference, which started with Perf and Ops, and while the two evolved into sort of their own two sub-conferences within it, the people interaction was significant.
Yes, it was.
So I'm totally scrapping my kind of people process technology flow, which I don't think was right to choose anyway. But I have one more question to you before we sort of do the conclusion question here, which is really around back to people, but the people themselves. So when you look at today's ops community, right? If you look at DevOps, you look at the skill set and the attitude, even a typical background, that person that is, I guess I'll call it a DevOps person or an SRE, I guess the better one, because DevOps shouldn't be a title. So, you look at an SRE today, it's very different than a decade ago what an ops person typically looked like, an IT ops type person. Many people in security sort of are worried about a similar type change happening here and what happens to them. Are there any learnings that you shared about how did either individuals or organizations successfully navigate that sort of skill set change that was required in the ops world? Is it literally like a turnover of the teams? You need to hire different people. Can you get reskilled? Is there a different approach? Any insights from that?
Yeah, I think that there is a very traditional view of a neck-beardy ops person in the basement playing around with Gentoo Linux or something. It's probably going to get me killed by a number of people. But I think it's about acceptance. And I think the security world has probably been through a cycle of this, which is moving from that, my job is to say no, my job is the sword and shield of the company, to being like, my job is a business enabler, and my job is a risk manager to help the business move faster in a safe and secure and as risk-friendly way as possible. So I don't know that this is that different of a cultural change. It's sort of like, in order to do that thing, I need to have a different skill set. And I think that if I think about the ops communities that I was involved with when I was in security, the vast majority of them would be considered sort of traditional sysadmins. They're more scripters than they were programmers or software engineers. In the security world, I was a very unusual in the sense that outside of the application security community, in the sense that I wrote code. The most of the people I knew were more analysts and technologists and infrastructure people and architects. Outside of that application security community, very few of the infrastructure security people, or even scripting, was sometimes not amongst their skill sets. So it may be a slightly harder bridge to cross, but I think that what we've learned is that if you are open to seeing that there's a new way of doing this that actually benefits you personally in terms of learning new things, but also in terms of getting paid more money. And that was pretty much my rallying call to any ops people that I talked to sort of in the early 2010, 2011 period when DevOps came around. I was like, this is a better job, right? Like, you are no longer being paged at 3 o'clock in the morning for stuff that you don't understand, or you can't work out what's going on, or you then have to get someone else out of bed, and it's an antagonistic process. You're still on call, but the process is smoother. Your skills are more in demand. You have set yourself up for a better career. And I think that that same message will resonate with the security community, which is you need to have some of these skills. Like the boundary between applications and infrastructure, the black box, the abstraction layer has moved up as such that you can no longer be a practicing security engineer unless you understand how the application works, how it's wired to the infrastructure, and then how that communicates out to the customer. If you can't sort of get your head around, okay, there's a JavaScript thing here and there's a Go thing here and there's a bit of Kubernetes stuff over there, I think your job prospects will suffer. So I think that there's a definite message there of you can uplift yourself. You can actually have a more fun job with a better skill set and a better salary.
I love this is a better job type message. I think it's a correct one and a very motivating one at that. James, one parting question, which I've been asking all guests this year. So take out your crystal ball. If you imagine someone doing your role today, which I understand is the engineering group, not a security group, but still with regards to security, if you look at someone doing the job you're doing today in 5 years' time, with regards to security, what do you see changing?
I will actually say that, and for a lot of people are only starting to touch on this, is privacy, data compliance, and data security. I think that for a lot of folks who've lived in the PCI DSS world, or this is something that we've known for a long time, that the most valuable asset in our company is the data we have about our customers and about the product itself. And a large number of people are starting to see GDPR as being something they have to care about. And it's amazing to talk to sort of our engineering leaders who are like, we've just been asked about GDPR and I've never even thought about a compliance regime before. I don't even know where all our data is and like, how do we classify it? And I think security people have an opportunity here there's a lot of hard lessons learned in the security world about data classification, about data management that have sort of parallels in this new world. I think that's going to be exacerbated further by the fact that distributed systems inherently distribute information too. The days of like monolithic databases are slowly disappearing, both in terms of like servicing data stores for individual services, but source of truth being, where are those sources of truth now? Mobile coming in, people being like, okay, we want to operate closer to the customer. They expect real-time or near zero latency. Does that mean we have to migrate their data closer to them? In which case, how do we protect it? So all of that stuff is where I'm thinking there's going to be I see the sort of edges of it right now. And if you've had anything to do with GDPR, like the tooling around it, the process, the government interactions, they're all hideous, right? And I don't know how sustainable that will be for long, but this will become an increasingly big problem. And I think there's an opportunity and a bunch of tools that will have to come out of that opportunity. So I'm thinking that that's somewhere that I put my crystal ball in, that I can see some big movement, and certainly similar way to the sort of DevOpsy, DevSecOps thing is reducing friction, like data security without the friction. I'm not sure where that's going to go, but that's something that I'm sort of tracking, I guess, passively at least.
Yeah, no, for sure. Definitely a big concern. I guess that would be a DevSec to DataOps, or I hope not.
No, I hope not.
No, not that. Well, James, this has been a pleasure. Thanks a lot for coming onto the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
And thanks everybody for tuning in, and I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at @DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.